Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to our third and final section within Unit 4, looking at consecrated life. Up to now, we've talked about the church as sacrament. We've looked at the models of the church, the various ways of seeing the church, and why it is that the church as sacrament is the model which is able to encompass all of the other ways of thinking and considering the church. We've seen how it is that the sacraments which Jesus has given us are able to allow us to live out the mission of the church as sacrament, and how priesthood then is so very vital to our own lives and to living out the church as sacrament, to being each of us a sacrament of Jesus Christ. Each of us individually and all of us together is called to exist as a sacrament, and the priesthood is what helps to make that possible by giving us all of the other sacraments. There's an additional dimension to the church, however. There's that spiritual, that inner dimension. Remember what happens if we forget things like the church as mystical communion. We have a risk of too superficial, too external focused model of the church, conception of the church. We need that life of prayer. We need that inner connection with Jesus Christ to truly live out the lives we were meant to be. And this is where consecrated life, religious life, individuals who take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience and dedicate themselves to a life of work and prayer exclusively in the service of Christ and witnessing to the life to come, these individuals remind us of an important dimension of the church and really call us all to live out our own mission as the church, to live out our own vocations as members of the church in a much deeper and in a much more prayerful and spiritual way. So with that, let's begin to take a look at the consecrated life, the religious vocation within the church. When we look at consecrated life, what we're going to see is that there are both male and female variations of consecrated life. There are options for men who wish to enter religious life and for women who wish to enter religious life. Among the men, we're going to see a number of different examples. So going from left to right up top, we have the Dominican order, the order of preachers, who in many ways exemplify what it means for the church to exist as herald. And this is the other thing too, with the various missions and ministries that the consecrated life and members of religious orders carry out, in many ways they show us the essence of what it means for the church to exist in this particular model, be it church as herald, church as servant, church as institution. All of them show a different dimension, a different way of existing in this model of the church, and so they can help us to truly all together round out our vision of the church. Similarly to the Dominicans, we have another mendicant order. The mendicants, as we will see, are groups that beg their daily sustenance from the people around them. They go out and they beg alms. They don't necessarily just live a stable life in a monastery. These are Carmelites, Carmelite priests. And they likewise, they live a life of great penance and a life of great austerity as they draw closer and closer to God, and especially contemplating Christ in his suffering. Next, this individual wearing the mitre rather, we might think, oh, he's got a mitre, he's got a crozier, he's standing in front of an altar. Clearly, this is a bishop. No, in fact, this is a Benedictine abbot. As we're going to see, abbots and abbesses rank in equal dignity, have an equal rank to bishops, and also archbishops are equal in rank to archabbots and archabbesses. And this is a Benedictine abbot. Next to him, we see another Benedictine from Benedictine College up in North Carolina. The contemplative life, the monastic life, is an absolutely essential element, and really, this is where religious life begins, in the abbeys, in the monasteries, with abbots and abbesses. With women, again, we see down in the lower left-hand corner, we see a Benedictine abbess, and because she ranks equal with a bishop, she also is entitled to hold the crozier, that pastoral staff that she's got, and to have the pectoral cross, that cross that goes in front of one's chest. Next to her are other Benedictine nuns. If you see a nun with an all-black outfit, very often those are Benedictines or some other group that's related to the Benedictines in some way, shape, or form. The Benedictine nuns, as with the Benedictine monks, give us the liturgy of the hours, that way of praying through all 150 psalms over a 4-week period. Each and every month, they recycling, going back through so that the psalms are those wonderful, beautiful chanted things that eventually get into your hearts. Next, after this, we see a Dominican sister from the order of Mary, Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. They're dedicated very much to primary education and other intellectual works. Sister there has her white habit on. She's not wearing her black cape, but you can see her black veil, which is the equivalent, more or less, of the black hood that that a Dominican friar would be wearing. Next to her, we have another woman from the Missionaries of Charity, the order that Mother Teresa founded. Mother Teresa was absolutely convinced that when she founded her order, when she sent her sisters out into some of the most squalid conditions of human suffering, the most bone-crunching poverty that you can imagine, she said the life of vows is absolutely essential to being able to go in there, because the life of vows gives us that inner disposition and gives us that disposition of mortification and penance, as well as prayer and spiritual support as well. Mother Teresa was convinced without that spiritual guidance, that spiritual life that comes through the life of the vows, her sisters would not be able to go. No layperson could go and do what it is that the sisters do, which is truly to work with the least and the absolute poorest of the poor. Next to her, we have a Carmelite sister from the Carmelite convent in Los Angeles. And you can see the Carmelite sister has a brown robe, not too much unlike the robe that the Carmelite friars there are wearing. And in Los Angeles, the Carmelite monastery there, the sisters divide their time. Some of the sisters are teachers, other sisters work in nursing homes. And those sisters, in fact, are also trained nurses, of course. They're RNs or BSNs. And this is part of the church's conviction that we are not just bodies or we're not just souls, we're bodies and souls united together. And so many religious orders have been dedicated to healthcare and to caring for a person, body and soul. So this sister is not only going to give health care to that elderly woman that you see down there, but then she's also going to pray with her and pray with her. And there are quite famous examples, both among men and women, of consecrated life. Among men, we see here Thomas Merton. He was a Trappist monk. We're going to find out a little bit more about what they're like. Basically, the Trappists are a very strict version of the Benedictines. Thomas Merton himself lived kind of a very wild life before he finally entered the Trappists. He lived in the early half of the 20th century. You know, he grew up an atheist. He had a number of girlfriends. He had a child out of wedlock. He was a great scholar as well. He was doing doctoral studies in English literature at Columbia University when he decided ultimately to enter the religious life. Slowly but surely, he had an experience of religious conversion and went from essentially being a stone-cold atheist to being more and more entranced with the spiritual life. Now, sadly, Thomas Merton's life was cut short in the 1960s. There's an interesting story about his death and a really awful and wonderful pun about the way in which he died, which if you stick around to the end, I'll mention it then. But Thomas Merton's book, The Seven-Story Mountain, really is an excellent spiritual memoir. He details his conversion. If you're ever interested in reading an account of what it is to convert and what it is to go from being stone-cold atheist to a monk, Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, among his other spiritual writings, is an excellent way to go. Among women, there is a Carmelite sister named Edith Stein. Now, Edith Stein was martyred. She was killed during World War II. She was a Jewish convert to Catholicism. She initially, before World War II, she was a philosophy PhD student. She was studying under Martin Heidegger, who is a great phenomenologist. It's a branch of philosophy. And she, too, did a lot of writing and a lot of study and research into phenomenology. Through this, eventually, through her philosophical research, eventually converted to Catholicism, and then decided to enter the Discalced Carmelites. It's a reform group of the Carmelites. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means later on in the section. Now, Edith Stein has a number of wonderful writings out there. She has excellent philosophical writings. She has truly deep and wonderful spiritual writings, her personal journals, everything. Eventually, she was martyred, as I'd mentioned. So Edith Stein, she was a German Jew who converted to Catholicism. And what would happen during World War II is that any time that the Catholic bishops decided to speak out against Nazi atrocities, the Nazi government would retaliate by raiding all of the convents and raiding the monasteries. And if they found any monks or nuns or anybody that they thought was Jewish, they would send them off to to the concentration camps. Edith Stein was one of those individuals caught in one of those roundups. She was born Jewish, she was fully Jewish by blood, and that was enough for the Nazis. So they sent her off, and she, unfortunately, tragically, she died in the gas chambers. I also draw special attention to her philosophical writings because while Martin Heidegger is certainly one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Heidegger also had, during World War II, flirtations with the Nazi Party. Edith Stein obviously had no such difficulty. So Martin Heidegger, without the baggage and with all the profundity, go with Edith Stein. This was a truly remarkable woman and a beautiful, beautiful story of martyrdom and unfailing compromise. So let's begin to take a deeper look at the inner spirit that animates all of these amazing men and women who make up the consecrated life, the religious life of the church. There was an ancient inspiration for all of this. Consecrated life really does have its roots in the earliest days of Christianity. Earliest Christian literature shows us that the vows of virginity had been made by certain Christians, both men and women, and was sometimes the cause of persecution. We see down here below an image of the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia, who is the patron saint of both musicians and of actors. Sometimes when we do masses for the Philelectic Society, we'll say a mass in honor of Saint Cecilia. She is one of our patronesses. There were a number of reasons why it was that people would be taking these vows, both men and women. They were inspired by a number of factors. First of all, there was the example of Jesus himself, who was completely unmarried, who was unmarried all throughout his life and beyond, of course. There was Jesus's praise of those who are voluntary eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Those are his direct words in Matthew 19:12, and he says something similar in Luke chapter 18. He has the statement, as we talked about last unit, about how there is no marriage in heaven. And so, as with priesthood, consecrated life and the individuals who took these vows of virginity were looking forward to how it is that we're going to be in the future once we finally get to the state where we're all in heaven and where the second coming has happened. We are witnessing to the last days. And then there is Paul's praise of celibacy in the first letter to the Corinthians. So there's no one particular reason, but there's a constellation of reasons why it was that early Christians from the very first days, Saint Cecilia is from the 100s. She's from the 2nd century. So she would have been just after the time of the apostles. This really was almost from the very beginning of the church, where Christians get the inspiration to take these vows of virginity, both men and women. By the 3rd century, so by about the 250s, the worst of the persecutions in the Roman Empire had ended. And Christians were still interested in giving themselves, giving their entire lives to Jesus Christ. To be a martyr was really seen as being one of the highest, the fullest way that one could live in imitation of Jesus Christ. This is why there was originally the tradition, anytime a new altar was set up to celebrate Mass on, a relic, a piece of either the personage or of the garments from a martyr had to be buried in somewhere in the altar table. Now it's extended to saints in general, but it began with, we're going to have altars set up on martyrs' tombs directly so that we have a link between the sacrifice of the Mass and the sacrifice of this martyr. Then it became, we're going to put a little piece of the martyr into this altar. Martyrs were seen as truly embodying the life of Christ. Well, once the age of martyrs really kind of ended in the church, at least in the early church, there are still martyrs today, of course, people began to ask, what is the way in which I can now continue to give myself completely and totally with my very body over to Jesus Christ? And so by the 250s, you have groups of Christians going out into the desert to live a life of penance and sacrifice, and would eventually do so in community. Places like Egypt and Jordan were some of the places where this was done most commonly, especially in Egypt. And this is where we have both the desert fathers and the desert mothers. the men and women, so the age of the church fathers, the fathers of the church, are about the first 5 centuries. The desert fathers and the desert mothers are those mystics who went out into the desert to live this life of prayer and live this life of penance. One of the most famous, one of the earliest, is St. Anthony of the Great, also known as St. Anthony of the Desert, who is generally considered the father of Christian monasticism. Religious orders, both in the East and in the West of Christianity, look to St. Anthony as their imitation. St. Anthony was walking into a church one day. He was a very wealthy man in Egypt. He was walking into a church, and the priest was preaching on how Jesus was interacting with the rich young man and saying, if you want to be good, sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. Anthony walked in right as the priest was saying these words. He was convicted on his heart. He realized, this is what I need to do. I need to sell all that I have. I need to go out into the desert. I need to get my life right, because right now I'm just an idle rich man who's just kind of frittering his life away. I need to get serious about my life. And the place in which he founded his monastery actually still exists to this day. And they would go out. They would, very often, they would carve out little places in caves where they would live. This is a picture of an actual, down here. This is what their homes actually did look like. This is not just a recreation. This is one of the original cave dwellings of some of the Desert Fathers. The middle is a painting of what it might have looked like in those days. So the individual has his prayers, he has his table, he has the various things that he needs. And it really is a quiet life of prayer. And then finally you see a Greek Orthodox monk living that life out today. Actually, probably a Coptic Orthodox monk living that life out today. Eventually, though, people began to follow them out into the desert and go to them for advice, saying, Anthony, you're a truly wise man. You know who Jesus is. Tell me more about Jesus. Or Macrina, if we want to talk about some of the desert mothers. Macrina, you know Jesus Christ. You're a truly wise woman. Tell me who Jesus Christ is. And they would gain these disciples, which brings us to the further development of monastic life. Eventually, these followers would become stable groups. And so people like Anthony decided, well, if I'm going to have followers and if I'm going to make myself imitate Jesus as fully as possible, what I need to do is I need to get myself 12 followers, and we're going to live in community. And the abbot or the abbess, from the Aramaic abba, will be in charge. And then so you have the abbot or the abbess, and then the 12 disciples, Christ and the 12 apostles. Very symbolic, very deep. St. Benedict and St. Scholastica, who are the founders of the Benedictine order and of Western monasticism, really are the individuals who gave us this gift. They were the first individuals to put this all out in a formal rule, the rule of St. Benedict. And St. Benedict and St. Scholastica were brother and sister, as it happens. St. Benedict founded the men's branch of the Benedictine order. St. Scholastica founded the women's branch of the Benedictine order. So Benedict would be one of the Desert Fathers, Scholastica, one of the Desert Mothers. The monastery, in this imagination, the monastery is first and foremost, it is a school of prayer. You go to the monastery in order to learn how to pray and to learn who Jesus Christ is. The work, any work that's done in the monastery, is for the support of the monastery. And there's various ways in which that could look. And we'll talk about that a little later on. Ora et labora, work and prayer. And then also a life of stability. The monk is going to vow himself, or the nun, in the case of a female religious. That's also important to remember. A nun, not all nuns, or not all sisters are nuns. A nun is a woman who lives in a monastery. It's a female version of a monk. All nuns are sisters, not all sisters are nuns. Remember that. I guarantee you it's going to be on the test. It's going to be a question. What's the difference between a nun and a sister? So we see here an image of St. Benedict and of St. Scholastica. And we even see down there that both Benedict and Scholastica have the crozier, the shepherd's staff, since Benedict is an abbess and Scholastica is an abbess. So through that work and through that prayer and through that life of stability, a monk is always attached to the same monastery throughout his life, or a nun. Even if they travel, even if they go somewhere for a little while, you are always fundamentally a member of that one monastery. And you vow stability and conversion of life. The monastery is where you learn who Jesus is. And this is also why, well into the modern era, there was a great tradition of notorious sinners, murderers, rapists, you name it, going to a monastery to convert and being welcomed as monks or welcomed as nuns. And if you think of it in those terms, that the monastery is where you learn how to pray and learn who Jesus is, it's not for people who are already mystics. It's for people who want to learn how to become mystics that you go to a monastery. And if that's the reason, if conversion of life is why you join a monastery, of course you would take notorious sinners. Of course you would take people who have done even truly awful things. And I think there's something to be said for that. And for the church having institutions that can support people who are willing to really have a radical reform of their lives. And the monastery, Benedict founded a number of monasteries. The most famous, and really the mother house of all Benedictine abbeys, is the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. And that was St. Benedict's own home base. Those of you who are history buffs may be thinking, oh, hey, that sounds like a World War II battle in the Italian front. It's actually the same place. And in fact, the Nazis hid some of their worst guns, their biggest guns, in the old Benedictine Abbey in the hopes that the Allied forces wouldn't attack the Abbey. The Allies were trying to be very careful, but they did in fact have to go attack the Abbey and to bomb the Abbey. It's been destroyed and rebuilt many times over the centuries, but it is fundamentally the same place, and the monks all still live there, and it is still the school of prayer that St. Benedict envisioned. With the Benedictine order, though, over the course of the centuries, there were a series of reforms in Benedictine monasteries. First, you have the Cistercians with St. Bernard. St. Bernard looked at the monasteries and he thought, we've gotten a little too soft. Benedictine life is a life of stability. And while that can be good in many ways, because there's a certain constancy and a certain repetition in your prayer life, it can also sometimes allow you, if you get too stable, you can also become too comfortable. And St. Bernard really wanted to change that. And so Bernard founded a new branch of the Benedictine family, the Order of Cistercians. So if you see OSB behind somebody's name, they're a Benedictine. If you see O-Cist, O period, and then big C, little IST, O-Cist, those are the Order of the Cistercians. The Cistercians they lived a simpler life than the Benedictines, and they had a much stricter rule of prayer. And one of the things that the Cistercians really saw as being part of their mission was they would go out and they would go and found their abbeys in some of the absolute most wild places where it was just completely overgrown. And then they would tame and farm the land and make it, basically terraform it, from this place of unimaginable wilderness to verdant and green pastures. They saw it as taking the chaos that's in creation and restoring God's order to it. And because of that, the Cistercians, all throughout the Middle Ages, were some of the great pioneers in agriculture, farming, animal husbandry techniques. The Cistercians really were true innovators in the field of agriculture and in the field of farming. Farmers all around Europe would look to the Cistercians for better cattle techniques, better crop techniques, and all of it. And the Cistercians, like the Benedictines, would engage in various works that support the monastery financially. After this, we have the Trappists, and we can see here, so you see down there, several of the Trappists. This is from the Trappist Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. Every Benedictine monastery, every Cistercian monastery, every monastery in general, they have some work, the point of which is to support financially the monastery, so it can continue as this school of prayer, so it can continue as this place of prayer. Some make caskets, some run schools, some brew beer. And some of the finest beers on the planet have been brewed by Benedictines and members of the Benedictine families, like the Trappists. Trappist ale is good. It's a closely guarded secret, the exact recipe, and the name Trappist ale is also very strictly under copyright, especially so that the Trappist monks in Massachusetts, when they decided, we want to support this monastery, the work of this abbey, through brewing, because beer's, it's always going to be a good seller. The Trappists in Europe said, that's fine, but you have to send your brewmasters over to us and learn from our brewmasters, in order to really get it right. And once the German Trappists were satisfied, okay, yes, these Americans are good brewmasters and they know what they're doing, then they allowed them to return to their home monastery, to their home abbey, and now Trappist ale out of Spencer, solid stuff. In addition, there is a much stricter form of monastic life called the Carthusians. Now, I had mentioned the Carthusians when I first talked about priesthood and consecrated life in general. And I showed y'all the trailer to Integrate Silence. Carthusians are essentially, they're an order of hermits. You can see here, if you look at the mother house, the charter house that St. Bruno founded, these are the houses of the monks. And essentially, each monk has his own cell, which is a two-story little area, and where he is able to engage in prayer, in study, whatever work he needs to do. And so we have hermits who live together. Remember, the Catholic Church is very convinced to be is to be in relation. We exist in society with other people. I need you, you need me. That is one of the major themes I hope you're picking up from these last two units of this class, that we need each other, and people need people. Men need women, women need men, priests need laity, laity need priests. Everybody needs everybody else. And so with the Carthusian vocation, they are hermits. So we want to be able to have people who are alone in prayer, but we don't want them to be too alone, because as Genesis reminds us, it is not good for the man to be alone. And so they have these cells which open out onto a common hallway, basically a whole bunch of houses. And then you might have areas like the chapel, the dining room, the library, all of the other things that they need in order to live. And the Carthusian life is actually very influential for the Jesuits. Jesuit spirituality is often described as Carthusian spirituality lived out in the world, and there's a lot of truth to that. One of the two books that Ignatius was trapped with when he was recovering from his leg injury after the Battle of Pamplona was A Life of Christ, written by a man named Ludolf of Saxony. And he was a Carthusian. And the way that Ludolf described the life of Christ and how we can pray over the life of Christ, St. Ignatius was very taken by that, and essentially had the Jesuits pray about Jesus in the same way that the Carthusians pray about Jesus. There's a very strong link between the Jesuit spirituality and the Carthusian spirituality. We are very much the spiritual sons of the Carthusians, and of this way of both being alone in prayer and together with other individuals. So these are the monastic vocations, really the beginnings of religious life within the church. Monasteries and other places of stable life, where you live that life of stability, of ora et labora, of work and prayer, is the beginning of religious life. But as we're going to see, around the 1200s, other forms of religious life then began to develop. And we're going to see that with the Dominicans, with the Carmelites, with other forms of religious life tomorrow. I had mentioned, speaking of the various other forms of religious life, so the Trappists, Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton died in 1969. The 50th anniversary of his death was celebrated last December. Over the course of the 60s, so Thomas Merton was a great literary figure himself, having studied literature at Columbia University. And so he was very much engaged with some of the great activists, both literary and social, of the mid-20th century. He exchanged letters with people like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, with Martin Luther King Jr., with other great social activists. And especially in the 60s, Thomas Merton started to do more and more research into the connections between monks in the Catholic tradition and monks in the Buddhist tradition, and kind of seeing where's the similarities, where are the differences. And so the way in which he died, he was going to a conference in Thailand to present a paper on the similarities and the differences between Catholic and Buddhist monasticism. And it was, even though it was December, it was very hot in Thailand, and so he was taking himself a bath in order to cool off. So he got into the bath, he turned on a little desk fan, and it was blowing, and it fell into the bathtub. It electrocuted him, and from that he died. Here's the pun. There was a biography of Thomas Merton's life that I read on one occasion, and the closing chapters, kind of summarizing Thomas Merton's life, noted his death, and the opening line to that chapter was, Thomas Merton's life was a lot like his death, electrifying. I can only hope that when it is my time to die and the good Lord calls me, he will call me to die in such a way that I too can give rise to such a wonderful, awful, truly glorious pun like that my life and my death will be electrifying, except some other really good pun. With that, gentlemen, have a good day and have an electrifying kind of life.